Tommy Von Voight back for our third time, and we are talking about Led Zeppelin, an amazing, iconic, global sensation at one point in the 70s, was the biggest band in the world and still remains to this day as one of the most influential bands on music. Still.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when we talk about Led Zeppelin, I talk about them in the context of the other greats. I talk about them in the context of the Beatles, the Stones, Queen. I mean, we're talking that level of a band that you couldn't really fathom. How could we have gone without them? You know what I mean? They're that important, I think.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and today we're going to explore all the juicy details as to why.
I think at some point in every guitar player's journey, they get the Jimmy Page bug, and I think it's kind of important. It's important to go through that phase. There's just something so just inherently cool about Jimmy Page in the 70s, just this swagger, the attitude. He was never really technically precise, but there was just something about his playing that was just so primal and urgent. How could you not want to sound like him?
I know. I mean, really, come on. For me, listening to Led Zeppelin kind of taps into the early 1900s, primarily with the blues players who had this weird characterization and lack of technical precision that modern guitar players put way too much emphasis on and are way too anal about. And Jimmy Page was like the rock and roll, unapologetic equivalent of like, forget that. I don't care. I'm just gonna just hop right in.
It's funny. It was early last year, I think January of last year. The production crew that I'm a part of, F-Bomb NYC, where we do a monthly tribute show for a different artist or a different band. We did Led Zeppelin back in January of last year. And for my set, of course, there was no way that was going to happen without me being on guitar. So I got to really dive in to Page's work. And yeah, you're right on the money with his approach. When you really start learning those solos and you're just like, what even is he doing? Like it's just a nonsense flurry of nonsense notes, but it just still sounds cool. And like there is in some parts of some of those solos, there isn't actually technically a right or a wrong way to even play it. It's just, but it just but yet somehow it still works, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's why I love like him and Dwayne Allman so much, amongst so many other guitar players. It's just this gibberish that just sounds so cool.
Yeah,
So,
it's beautiful
as-
gibberish. Yeah.
yeah. So aside from it just being beautiful gibberish, let's take a hop, skip, and a jump before we start talking all that technical guitar schmitar stuff. Um, let's talk about this four piece, their formation.
Well, the formation is really a fascinating story, especially when you think about, like we said at the top of the episode, how critical Zeppelin really is in the grand scheme of things, in terms of music history, in terms of culture, and how close they came to not happening at all. And I mean, like in any capacity. And a lot of people don't realize that it was almost an accident that Led Zeppelin just came to be. Now, of course, you're probably very familiar with this, but for a lot of viewers that don't, we'll start there with it starts with the Yardbirds, as you're aware, which was the incubator for a lot of famous British guitar players, notably Eric Clapton, and then Jeff Beck, and then Jimmy Page. All ended up coming in and out of the Yardbirds. And it was towards the end of their tenure as an actual active band that Jimmy Page was a member of the band, and they were just constantly fighting, and they weren't really making any money, and the music wasn't selling, and the hits had dried up. And at that point, Peter Grant, who you're familiar with, Peter Grant, who became famous as Led Zeppelin's manager, he became the Yardbirds manager towards the very end, and he managed to actually get them some paying gigs. But at that point, it was too late. They were looking to fall apart, and fall apart they did, and they fell apart so badly that they didn't even care what happened to the name, to the point where Jimmy Page asked them, "Hey, can I just go ahead and use the name?" And they're like, "Yeah, that's not worth a sod. Take it." And so they gave him the blessing to use the Yardbirds name. But the problem is now he was basically left holding the bag for a bunch of concert dates that hadn't yet been fulfilled. And the promoters were going to sue somebody. So Jimmy had to basically hurriedly put together a new group to fulfill those contractual obligations. And he knew John Paul Jones, the bass player from Led Zeppelin, from his days as a session musician, because that's how Jimmy really cut his teeth as a guitar player, was as a session musician. He's on countless recordings from the 60s. So he was tight with John Paul Jones, and he's like, "Jonesy, we're going to put together a group." But they didn't know what they were going to call it. They didn't know what they were going to do, what kind of music was going to be, who else was going to be in it. So this is where it gets really interesting. So Jimmy knew of this singer named Terry Reid. Terry Reid was also known as Super Lungs in the late 60s. I think it was Aretha Franklin that said there's only three things happening in England right now: the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Terry Reid. And Terry Reid was just such an incredible vocalist that everyone was absolutely certain that he was going to be the next big thing to come out of England. And when you listen to Terry Reid from that period of time, he's doing like what Robert Plant became famous for doing, like that the crazy banshee wails going from low to high and at the drop of a hat. So Jimmy Page approached Terry Reid, says, "I want to put together a group. We want you to be the singer." Well, actually, he had Peter Grant reach out to Terry Reid and said, "We want Jimmy Page wants to put together this group. He wants you to be the singer for it." And Terry says, "Okay, I guess I'll give it a shot. But I just agreed to go out on tour for the Stones, opening up for them for like the next 40 dates. If you can wait till I get back, we can give this a shot." And Peter Grant's like, "No, no, no, it has to be right now. You've got to decide right now." So Terry Reid was like, "If you can reimburse me for the money I was going to make on the Stones tour and call Keith Richards and tell him why I had to pull out, I'll give it a shot." And they weren't willing to do that. So finally, Terry Reid's like, "Well, okay, look, I can't do this, but I saw this band called the Band of Joy recently. And there's this young 18 or 19-year-old singer named Robert Plant that he was singing, and I thought he was really good. No one knows who he is, but maybe Jimmy should go reach out to him. But here's the thing: if Jimmy calls him and Robert wants to do it, tell Jimmy he's got to also get the drummer." The drummer was John Bonham. So Jimmy goes to see Robert Plant perform, and he's blown away, and he figures there's got to be something wrong with this guy. How is he not already famous? He must be a nightmare to work with. He must be crazy.
Yeah.
I don't know if I should even go. I don't know if I should even pull him aside and talk to him. But pull him aside and talk to him, he did. And he convinces him to come and do a thing. And he, of course, was blown away by John Bonham. And he asked John Bonham to come along too. And John Bonham's like, "I don't know if I can do this. This band I've got is paying me a guaranteed like 50 pounds per week, and I've got a family." So he was afraid that he was going to walk away from a guaranteed paying gig to go start this band with Jimmy Page and go broke. So like at any given moment, any of these guys can be like, "I'm out." But fortunately and fortuitously for the rest of us, they all decided to get together and jam. And as soon as they did, they all looked around and like the hair stood up on their, on their arms. And they're like, So they were like, "Okay, let's call this band the New Yardbirds. We'll go out on tour and fulfill those contractual obligations." They finished those tour dates. And then the bass player from the Yardbirds sends Jimmy a cease and desist and says, "All right, enough is enough. Stop using the Yardbirds. Come up with your own friggin' name." And that's when they came up with Led Zeppelin. So that crazy sequence of events is what birthed Led Zeppelin. And it was so close to not happening at any step of the way. Terry Reid could have said yes. John Bonham could have said no. Robert Plant might have been sick when Jimmy went to go see him. He might have sounded like crap. And when you think of Led Zeppelin, I can't picture that band working without each of those four guys. And it very easily could have not happened.
Yeah, it truly was a unique formation of a band that came together and created such a unique style and sound that to this day, I don't think anyone even comes close to sounding like. Even bands that intentionally aim for, not to talk ill of another band, but a group like Greta Van Fleet, who obviously goes for those 70s style sounds. I mean, even people who intentionally attempt to recreate it are not successful.
Yeah, and without going too much down a rabbit hole about them, I think the biggest issue with them is the material just isn't strong enough. I think that's the problem, and they are nailing the look and the sound, but the songs aren't quite there. And you without the material, it's just not happening. But Zeppelin had the material, although that's a whole separate conversation when you talk about the turn of the century blues artists.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
you talk about Zeppelin's material.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they were that band that when they started, I mean, their first album, like Led Zeppelin 1, was just pretty much covers. They were covering a lot of the music that they grew up listening to.
And not properly giving people the credit that they covered the songs for, which ended up being settled in court for most of that. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm disparaging because I absolutely worship Led Zeppelin, but I mean, look at a song like Dazed and Confused on the first album. When I first discovered Led Zeppelin, that song just absolutely just blew my mind. Come to find out years later, they stole it almost entirely from a singer named Jake Holmes, who had put it out like about a year and a half prior with the same title. I mean, Zeppelin might have stolen like crazy on those first two records, but they did steal it with style.
They did. Yeah, they did. So, so they get together, and in Led Zeppelin 1, within all of their songs, what's kind of that first kickoff for you as a performing, playing musician, and even going all the way back to 13? What like came out and was like, oh my God, I haven't heard anything like this. This is crazy how they're doing this. That sounds amazing. This is unique.
Well, now, for me, obviously, when I discovered them, I was around 13 or so. And we're talking now, this is around 1990, 1991, right? So they're obviously long since being an active group. So I'm discovering them all years after their entire catalog is ready for me to discover all in one batch. So I didn't go through like the people at the time went through, where they discover where Led Zeppelin 1 comes out and blows people's minds, and then Led Zeppelin 2 comes out and blows people's minds, and then Led Zeppelin 3 comes out and confuses people, and then Led Zeppelin 4 comes out and blows people's minds. So I don't know if you could say that was a good thing or a bad thing, but for me, my Led Zeppelin experience was discovering stuff off of Led Zeppelin 2 at the same time I'm discovering stuff off In Through the Outdoor. So for me, what blew me away was the unbelievable diversity of the group. If you're back in 1969, in January of 1969, when Zeppelin 1 comes out, that record is incredible, but that record sounds very cohesive, and it sounds like that record, and it sounds really nothing whatsoever like the stuff on Physical Graffiti. It sounds like nothing whatsoever like the stuff on In Through the Outdoor. It's still an incredible record, but the people at the time didn't have the experience I had, where they're just getting blown away by this massive, diverse catalog of music that was all put out within about a 10-year span of time. So that was something that really just blew me away, was how incredibly diverse that band was. And I don't think at the time I really had an understanding of that, peculiar vantage point that I had versus the people that got into them at the time they came out.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, they definitely are. They definitely are a really diverse band.
Incredibly, yeah.
Yeah, and it really does come to life either if it's um, obviously the British influence, where you get to hear some of those classical lines, like out of, as an example, like Stairway to Heaven, where you get to hear the really just craziness of Bonham's drumming and characterization in the way that he plays those rhythms. Or if it's that Sonny Boy Williamson style harmonica that Robert Plant has, or it's like almost, it makes sense and it goes along with it, but it also comes very unexpectedly out of Jonesy's bass and keyboard playing.
Yeah. And by the way, I don't know if you realize this, but you kind of vaguely resemble John Paul Jones right now. While we're on the subject of Jonesy, you kind of vaguely sort of look like him, circa Song Remains the Same era.
Nice. It's out of anybody to look like, might as well be Jonesy. Funny enough, I normally get told I look like Stevie Ray Vaughan, but it's probably because my hair is not as long today.
Oh, right on. Yeah.
Maybe could be something to do with the hat. All right, so let's dive in on Led Zeppelin 1.
Yes. Yes. Earth-shaking album. You know, I mean, look at the period of time that that record came out, and we're talking 1969, and we've touched upon that year before when we talked about Sabbath's early days. You know, we're talking like we're right on the cusp of the creation of heavy metal. Um, it's just an absolutely game changing year, and for Led Zeppelin one to come out in January of that year had to have just knocked everybody's heads right off. Because even though it sounds very much like an extension of the supercharged British blues thing, this took it to a place that just became timeless. You know, you listen to Led Zeppelin 1, and even though, yes, it's clear it came out in 1969, it hasn't aged a day. It really hasn't. It's every bit as exciting and primal and urgent as it was the month it came out, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. It is one of those albums that came out in 1969 where, yes, it does sound like an album that comes out in 1969, but yes, it is timeless. Um, is there anything from either the way it was recorded or comparing it to whatever else was coming out at that time that really broke the mold, that really,
um, you know, an interesting thing about the way it was recorded. Well, first, there's common misconceptions about how that album was recorded. It was actually recorded in a very short period of time, and Jimmy Page actually played through, I believe, a small Supro combo amp and a Telecaster on that album. And you would never associate that equipment with the sound of Led Zeppelin, but that's actually what he used. Also, Jimmy Page was the producer. Jimmy Page was incredibly hands-on from day one, and that was not a very common thing. But he was drawing upon his years of experience as a session musician. He understood how to use the studio as an instrument, and he truly did. And they weren't just going in and clinically recording the sound of the band. He was using the studio as an instrument to take the band's sound to another level. And I thought that was pretty fascinating the way he did that. I mean, he managed to get John Bonham's drums to sound absolutely larger than the universe on what was, you know, by today's standards, incredibly primitive recording technology at the time. So that's pretty fascinating. When you compare it to other records that came out in about a 6 month span before and after, this sounds leaps and bounds better.
yeah. And comparatively, what made John Bonham's sound so much different in compared to everyone else? Like, was he working on like a multi-piece drum kit where everybody was using a three-piece drum kit? Was everybody just kind of having a simple tap rhythm?
Well, you know, it's there's two reasons for it. Number one is just simply the way John played. You know, if you put John on pretty much any drum set, stuck a mic on it, you're going to know it's John Bonham. And of course, that's why the guy got the gig. But the other reason is Jimmy, I think, just keenly was aware of the fact that he had something special and he needed to capture it. He needed to capture it right. And he wanted to make sure that John Bonham came across on recordings as larger than life as he sounded in person. And I think he did a hell of a job of it. You know, making sure that he was in a very big live active room, something that was going to have a lot of space, a lot of depth. You know, he wanted to make sure the drums had punch and boom and depth to them. And I think he managed to get that across.
Nice. And what was the rest of the band doing on that album that stands out?
Well, I think one thing that stands out is they were basically a brand new band that had just cobbled this material together in less than a couple of months. Go into the studio with very little time and not a whole lot of money, with the guitar player producing, and managed to sound like that. And I think what that speaks to is it speaks to just how talented the guys all were. Jimmy knew what the hell he was doing. John Paul Jones knew what the hell he was doing. John Bonham was just that damn good. And Robert Plant, what you're hearing like a 19-year-old singing that way on his debut album. There's no studio trickery. They didn't spend 2 months tracking the vocals to try to get everything right and going line by line, word by word. I mean, he's just going in there and he's just killing it. And that's something incredibly magical about that album. You can't fake that, you really can't.
Yeah. And are there things on that album? I know you just mentioned that he's using a Telecaster and a Supro, which I'm pretty sure for laymen they'll probably be like, huh? Um, but were there,
Well, the reason why I mentioned that is because commonly people who don't even really understand any kind of technical stuff, they just picture Jimmy Page and they're automatically picturing him with a Les Paul playing through a wall of Marshalls, of course, but that's not how he got that sound.
yeah. But were there things like technically that was in the playing or technically that they were using in their gear that helped make that sound so unique?
Nothing much more than what we talked about already. Believe it or not, a lot of what you're hearing is just the raw talent of each member. There's not a whole lot of studio trickery going on. I mean, he's pushing that Supro as hard as he possibly can. It's holding on for dear life, obviously. Um, you know, John Bonham's beating those drums like they owe him money. But other than that, no, there's no special thing that if you go and get this piece of equipment, now all of a sudden you'll sound just like so and so on Zeppelin 1. It really, a lot of it is just the raw talent of the members that were recording it. And that's, I think, so incredible about that album.
Yeah. And just quickly on, I mean, like, I know, like, you and I both know from being guitar players for so long. I mean, if there's anything like somebody can pick up a guitar for and play just about anything on it, it'd be either a Les Paul, a Telecaster, or a Stratocaster. But what about Jimmy's Supro amp that was so different compared to like a Marshall or another iconic?
Well, the Supra wasn't really trying to compete with Marshall at the time. Marshall was trying to get louder and dirtier as each year went by. And the Supro was really, I think it was kind of more kind of being in the family of a Fender or a Vox. You know what I mean?
So cleaner
And
tone.
it's just a cleaner tone. But the thing is if you took any of those amps, even if they were designed to do X, you cranked them loud enough, all of a sudden they were doing Y. Because if you push any of those circuits beyond what they're designed to be used for, you just crank the knobs and all of a sudden you're saturating the output section. It's screaming for, now everything's distorting. And of course, it's not going to sound like a Fender twin reverb anymore. You know what I mean? So it's just basically pushing the equipment beyond really what it was intended to be used for.
Yeah.
And then you get glorious sounds. And then if you play very aggressively, if you put
Yeah.
a treble booster in front of it or something like that, it'll give up the goods.
Yeah. It will give up the goods. Okay. So Led Zeppelin 1 happens, and then we move on to Led Zeppelin 2.
Yeah, and Led Zeppelin 2, we're talking just later that same year. And if you compare the two albums, it's like, oh, it's clearly the same band, but my God, what an artistic leap. I mean, Led Zeppelin 1 is a stunning album, but Led Zeppelin 2, in my opinion, is really when they truly arrive as a cohesive band. Like, I think that they've really found their sonic identity on that album. Most of the material on there is all originals that they wrote. Robert Plant, at this point in time, has now been getting more and more encouragement to write lyrics. That was a problem at first with him. He was very unsure of himself as a writer, and they had to keep pushing him, like, no, Robert, you need to explore this. This is your role. You can do this. And this is when we start hearing more and more about hobbits, because he was reading a whole lot of Tolkien at the time. So you get a lot of Tolkien in Zeppelin lyrics because that's what Robert was reading about. So that's what he started singing about.
Yeah. It's awesome. And one of the greatest rock bands of all time is singing about token hobbits.
Yep.
Got some classics like Ramble On.
Oh yeah, but Gollum, the evil one, crept away with her, and like he's like singing about Gollum. What?
Love it. Absolutely love it.
Yeah.
Um, were there things on it that as a musician,
Well, you're hearing more and more of Jimmy Page's sonic experimentation for sure. And we heard some of that on Led Zeppelin 1 for sure. And like the Days to Confuse, Zeppelin 1 is where he starts with the, playing his guitar with the violin bow. And, Zeppelin 2, the sonic experimentation just goes even further. Think about a song like Whole Lotta Love, like the crazy sound collage that happens during the breakdown of that song. Just all sorts of crazy sound effects and him using a theremin and just it's incredible to listen to even to this day. And it just, I remember when I was 13 and I was first getting into these guys, and I'd be like, oh my god, Dad, have you heard this band? He's like, yes, I've heard of Zeppelin. And a Whole Lot of Love would come on, and he's like, this whole section here is supposed to be the sound of a Zeppelin crashing. And I'm like, I don't know that that's really the case, but like these kinds of sonic experimentations certainly led people to ponder what did it mean? What are they trying to say musically? I just think that's really fascinating stuff.
That is
And
really
then,
fast.
of course, yeah, and then they've got a track on Zeppelin 2, Moby Dick,
Oh
which
yeah.
is just a showcase for Bonham. Just
Yep.
incredible stuff. So they really started really pushing the envelope and showing the world what they could do as a band, what every member was capable of, and just how far they could take that supercharged blues sound, which was, at this point, it's very quickly becoming clear that this is something new. This is where rock and roll is heading. This is proto metal. This is very hard rock. This is the sound of the next decade, especially when we get to Zeppelin 2.
Yeah. That is actually funny when you were talking about Whole Lot of Love, talking about sonic experimentation. I remember one particular interview with Eddie Kramer, he and Jimmy Page. So Eddie Kramer, for people who don't know, is like the guy who has
Yep.
mixed together rock and roll stuff. And I would love to sit down and talk with him, not just about the bands that he's worked with, but I would love to talk with him about what led up to that point where that one studio executive decided, "Hey, Eddie, you're gonna get your start in rock and roll by working with Jimi Hendrix." Um, but he and Page just instinctively the famous like increased reverb line at the beginning of Whole Lot of Love. Just for some reason, he just instinctually went ahead, grabbed the reverb, and cranked it all the way up. He saw the missing piece of the puzzle.
I
Yeah,
love it. I love hearing about that kind of stuff. That just little magical moments like that came to mold and shape the records that we cherish.
yeah, it's cool, and that people knew that like back then they knew it well enough to where they're like, oh, let's just throw this in, or on the spot they could figure that out.
Yeah. But it's important to note though that in spite of all the studio experimentation, how far they were looking to push it, you are still hearing a band that just inherently just sounds damn good. And they were going to make a good record if they went to the studio to cut Zeppelin 2, no matter which direction they went with it. It was going to be a good record. They just were they were just a good sounding band. You're not hearing the product of studio magic with these guys. So when I talk about, oh, Jimmy Page, he's playing the studio like it's an instrument himself, and he's layering all his guitar parts to create his guitar army and everything like that. Like it's not trickery in a negative sense. I mean, these guys just were going to sound good no matter what they did.
Yeah, it was just a new thing for them to toy around with.
Basically, yeah.
Right on, right on. Um, so we're there, yeah, so we go from two to three, and then we get into four.
Yeah. So three, it took me a long time with Zeppelin 3 because they made a conscious decision. They're like, let's deliberately go in a different direction and get more experimental with our music itself. Obviously, some of Zeppelin 3 is huge and heavy and bombastic. You got Out on the Tiles, Celebration Day, Immigrant Song, but
Yeah,
they also wanted to explore the stripped down, folksy acoustic side that they were all into. And that was something that took me a very long time to get with. I always kind of ranked Zeppelin 3 kind of low in terms of my favorite albums from them for a long time, because it wasn't really entirely what I wanted from them. but they did it on purpose because they wanted to make sure people knew that they had range. And I have to respect that. As an artist myself, I understand why they would do that, and I have to respect it. But then they went back to business as usual for Zeppelin 4. And of course, Zeppelin 4 is one of those albums that you look at Zeppelin 4 and it's basically a greatest hits album. I mean, from start to finish, it's incredible.
Yeah. I
And
would
Zeppelin
say
4, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
I would argue that it's not necessarily back to business as always. I think they kind of integrated a little bit of what they were doing on three into four.
Well, sure. You've got Going to California. You've got Four Sticks. It's kind of experimental. Um, but, of course, it still, to me, sounds very much like the next album from the band that did Zeppelin 2. And it's got some of my favorite tracks by them ever. Misty Mountain Hop. When the Levee Breaks, you
Yep.
know, it's
Yep.
just incredible stuff.
Yeah. All the stuff that you always put on at a party.
Hmm. Yep.
Um, all right. What made so when we got on to four, I think this was kind of the real game-changing album. Um, because this was for the first time, Stairway to Heaven kind of broke the mold with the radio, and they had a shortened version of it that they'd play only on the radio until people got the album and then started calling in being like, play the full song.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure that probably pissed Zeppelin off too, that was even happening because Zeppelin did not like singles. They wanted very much for people to buy the whole album and appreciate the album start to finish as one complete work of art. And they were very much opposed to the idea of putting stuff out as singles. So if that was happening on the radio and word got back to them, they were probably none too pleased with that. But I do think that they had to know when they were working on Zeppelin 4 what they were about to put out. They had to have known. In fact, I'm sure they did because Jimmy Page almost had a near meltdown when they worked on the mix, I believe in LA, and he did the mix for the album. And then they took the tapes back, I think, to England. I might be mixing it up. It might have been he did the mix in England and they went to LA, or he did the mix in LA and they went back to England. It's been years since I've dove into that. But he got back to, like, I think England, and took a listen to the mixes, and he thought it sounded like absolute trash. And he freaked out and he's like, how did I screw it up? I ruined the album. I mixed the whole album in LA and it sounds like trash here. I got to redo everything. So he completely remixed the whole album for Zeppelin 4 from scratch because he was like, I've ruined it. I've messed it up. Oh no. Like he must have known they had something really important on their hands, and he had to get this right. And of course he got it right.
Yeah. Yeah. Were there like for you, were there like was this just kind of like just another really good rock album, or as you studied it over the years in their progressions as going from one to four, would they start inquiring aside from some experimentation, um, messing around with the electronics or inquiring acoustic, folksier kind of stuff? Were there other things that they brought in that changed their music or added to it?
I think things really start changing with Zeppelin 5, Houses of the Holy. I think that's when we really, really start getting more of John Paul Jones's presence. I think. Yeah.
And what
Much,
presence?
much more so.
And what presence did
Well, the,
John bring?
well, the orchestrations that he would bring to the table. I mean, we already heard his work on all for the first four albums. You're hearing all those orchestrations. That's all Mellotron. The stuff on Stairway to Heaven, like that flute, that's a Mellotron. That's John Paul Jones. Well, a lot of that stuff. Anything that sounds like an orchestration on Zeppelin is usually John Paul Jones with a Mellotron. I mean, Kashmir, that's John Paul Jones with a Mellotron playing fake strings. But I think that really starts really coming to the forefront on Houses of the Holy for me. I think, yeah, yeah, even more so than Zeppelin 4. I think we might not totally agree on that, but for me, it's Zeppelin. I think it's Houses of the Holy where really things really start changing. Yeah. Yeah, I recently did a ranking the Zeppelin albums video on this other YouTube show that I do, as it should be, and not a single one of us had the same albums in the same spot. And we all passionately believed we were absolutely right. So,
Yeah, that is true. Everyone is passionately right,
yep,
even if they might be factually wrong.
doesn't matter. They passionately believe that no, this is the album where this the blah 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 blah, and this is clearly better than that one. It's like, man, Zeppelin, it somehow manages to be polarizing and bring people together in that way. It's really funny.
Yeah. Now I got a friend who's in a rock band, and he and I will have these incredibly passionate debates on what we think was the best, the worst, why we thought it improved, why we thought it worsened.
Hmm. I
Um,
mean, look, I mean, when you talk about one, two, three, four houses, each one is a musical step forward. Each one, the band is clearly evolving. They just keep stepping their game up. They just keep trying to incorporate new elements of their music. They just keep growing more and more into themselves. Each one, I think, is just boom, 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 just the next step, the next step, the next step. For me, I think it's clear. And I think a lot of people might agree with me on those first five albums for sure.
I definitely do agree with like each, like each experimentation or thing that they're bringing in on each on each album, and then on the fifth one, I'd totally forgotten about this House of the Holy. It totally blows it, like they totally blow up and start going all over the
I
place.
think that's what they definitely did on Houses of the Holy. I mean, look at Houses of the Holy. You could see how they sat around and were like, "Oh, we're really into James Brown. Let's write a James Brown style song. Oh, we like reggae. Let's write a reggae influenced song. Let's just all these different things. Let's incorporate all these different influences, all this stuff that we've been listening to that we haven't really had a chance to toy with. I mean, it's just it's a stunning achievement, but also still retaining their classic sound on songs. Stuff like The Ocean, that's classic Zeppelin. So, yeah, I think Houses is an incredible album.
Yeah. So we kick off from Houses. We get on to our next album. Did things change? Whereas the band's climbing fame causing conflict or get interfering?
So now we're moving on to Physical Graffiti. I love Physical Graffiti. I really do. But I say that fully willing to admit that it is a flawed album. It is overly long. It is, as you're well aware, it is made up of about 50% new material that they had worked on for their next album. And they had worked up enough that it was going to be like more than an album's length. So they're like, okay, we've got a bunch of other tracks left over from like Zeppelin 3, from Zeppelin 4, from Houses of the Holy sessions. Let's finish those up and throw them on here and we'll make a double album. And that's what they did. And a double album, there are very, very few double albums that I'll go to the mats for. Almost every double album that's ever come out, you could you could really argue that you could arguably cut it down to one incredible single album. And I think the same could be said for Physical Graffiti. I don't know exactly which ones I would cut for sure to get it down to a single, but it's not a perfect album because there is some fat on there. There's some bloat. But in spite of that, I feel like for me, Physical Graffiti is almost the definitive Zeppelin album. And it goes even beyond technical reasons. There's just some kind of dark magic to Zeppelin. When I think about the mighty Led Zeppelin, and I think of the mysticism and all the rumors and urban legends surrounding that band, I think for me, it's the sound of Physical Graffiti. It's just there's some kind of dark magic that album has from the very beginning, and it's got some of my absolute favorite Led Zeppelin songs, and it's The Rover. Oh my God! In My Time of Dying, 10-minute long song. It sounds like it's 3 minutes. It's just an incredible, incredible album, and it's so diverse from one end to the other. It's like they explore everything they ever wanted to mess with on that one album. and it's like it's the definitive Led Zeppelin statement to me. It really is. So even though it's kind of a bloated double album, I don't think that that shows the cracks in the surface yet with the band. I think that that's still to come. It's not Physical Graffiti for me.
Yeah.
I mean, how does that record hit you though? I mean, I'm talking about it like it's some kind of magical entity. I mean, do you feel like it's just okay?
No, I agree with you. It's too long and it's a double album. And I'm going to say, I will agree with you saying 9 out of 10 times. A double album probably shouldn't have been a double album. It probably could have been redo like every song on that, as great as it is, and as much as I love. And probably when this interview is over with, when I go make myself dinner, I'm going to listen to Physical Graffiti now, of all things. I'm probably gonna flip it on.
That's
You got me
terrific.
thinking about it. And yeah, definitely. There is an amazing way how they build up and draw people in and suspense. And it's kind of the only band that's really coming to my mind at the current moment that might do extended songs that knows how to captivate someone in a way where you're like, oh, okay, please, please, I need to hear more. This is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
This is mystical. Um, is certain songs that for some reason I'm Tool's the only band that's coming to mind. Um, but
Yes.
yeah, but that's because they're like masters of build up and suspense and build up and suspense, and then finally at the end there's like a huge payoff when they get all crazy at the end. Um,
Yeah.
and it's not like a heavy rock thing where it's like build up suspense, and then here comes the payoff. You listen all the way to the end of the song, and damn, it feels good. Um, it's just more like this just steady climb, whatever they're doing. It's like being on a roller coaster. Those really high up, you get drawn all the way up to the top, and then goes right down. Like, this is fun. Um,
Yeah, they're taking you on a journey on Physical Graffiti. I mean, obviously not every song on the album is like this, but a lot of them are. The Rover takes you on a journey. In My Time of Dying takes you on a journey. Kashmir takes you on a journey. In the Light, 10 Years Gone. I mean, it's just mind-blowing stuff. I mean, Physical Graffiti, where they're going musically on this album is like when you imagine being in some, dark basement with wood panels on the walls in the 70s, listening to vinyl and wanting to go on a fucking journey with the band,
yeah,
like and you've got a black light poster in front of you and you just want to put on an album that's going to just take you on a trip somewhere. Like
yeah,
Physical Graffiti is that album. It really
yeah,
truly is.
definitely.
Like they absolutely killed it with this album.
I will also say I do know that at this time, roughly, Jimmy Page owned Aleister Crowley's house,
Yes, he did.
where some of Crowley's most evil actions ever happened, which
Yes,
weirdly enough is now going to become a public library in like 2025 or 2026.
because why not?
Yeah, because
But
why not?
because why not? But yeah, Jimmy Page. Yeah, so that's actually a good point for you to bring up. So I talk about how this album in particular has this incredible, intoxicating dark magic to it, and Jimmy Page at the time was really dabbling in actual dark magic. And
Yeah,
yes, he purchased Aleister Crowley's house. He was really into reading the works of Aleister Crowley. Unfortunately, he also started dabbling in heroin, which was soon to become a really big problem for him. I remember joking with a friend of mine, teacher friend Matt Baker, years ago about this song "In the Light," and I was like, I don't know, man. I feel like Page was in the dark for this one. Just thought that was the funniest because, of course, he was all too familiar with Page's state of mind at this point in time, and perhaps it was not the healthiest point in Jimmy Page's life.
yeah,
But he got
definitely.
some incredible music that came out of it. So
Yeah, and I think too. I mean, I think if Page was able to write, I think weirdly enough, I think this is one of those things where like what was going on in the artist's life perfectly matched the music too. Like Page,
Yes.
there are songs like In the Ocean, as an example. I really feel as though he is just what's coming out is Page's heroin addiction at this point is like he really is in an ocean of not fun when you're doing heroin.
Yeah, I don't know for sure exactly when he first started doing it and when it became, I mean, the second he did it, it was a problem, but when it became a noticeable problem. But this is around that time period for sure. And it'd be hard to imagine that not affecting your artistic output. It'd be hard to imagine that not coming through in your work in some capacity. Even if he wasn't doing it on purpose, it had to have been coming through.
Oh, definitely, absolutely, 100%. I mean, I've never done anything. I don't even at like almost 30. I don't. I like now. I couldn't even be more avoidant of alcohol. But I've seen it. But it totally sucks because you see like the best musicians ever. Like as soon as they start dabbling in drugs, it just goes downhill. It crashes. They hit that low. The work suffers. Um.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is going to factor into the Zeppelin story in a bit too.
Yeah. So I mean, is there anything else though um with physical graffiti that you want to cover or talk about before we get into our next chapter of the Zepp?
No, we should probably go ahead and move on to the elephant in the room. We should talk about presence.
Yes, and what presence it has in Led Zeppelin. I feel like it's the band where like their their album titles perfectly line up with
Yep. Yeah. When you get to presence, it's like, yep, this album's here. Man, I'll tell you what. All right. So presence to me very much sounds like an afterthought. And I do know that they went into, I think it was Musicland Studio or Musicland Studio in Germany to record it. And they were kind of vying for time with the Rolling Stones, who were trying to cut tracks for their next record. And because they had always had a bit of a healthy competition with other, god tier rock and roll bands. And I think at one point Mick shows up, I think all prepared to kick Zeppelin out. Your time's up. We need to cut tracks. And Zeppelin was like, "Ah, we're all done. You're all done. Yeah, we recorded the entire record in like just a couple days or whatever it was." So like they recorded Presence in like no time flat. And like apparently like Mick's jaw just was like couldn't believe that they were that efficient and they managed to get their whole record done that quick. I think it's a terrible album. I think I think it's awful. I think it's the biggest crime it commits is it's just forgetful. It's forgettable. It doesn't stick with you. I know some people like Achilles' Last Stand. I don't really care for it. I think it's bloated and overlong. I happen to love Nobody's Fault But Mine. I think it's fantastic. I would have loved if Nobody's Fault But Mine had ended up on Physical Graffiti. Presence just doesn't need to be there.
It's
And
just
the thing, it's present and it didn't need to be. Every couple of years, I'll come back to presence. Somebody will be like, "Oh, you got to reassess presence." Like when we did the Zeppelin tribute show last January, the bass player that was in the band with me, he's like, "Oh, you're not giving it a fair shake. It's got a lot to offer you. Go back and revisit presence." And I'm like, "Man, I've been revisiting presence every 3 or 4 years since I was like 14 years old. It has never stuck. I don't think it's going to stick, but I'll revisit presence again." And I did, and I didn't like it. And then I revisited presence like a month and a half ago, and I didn't like it. I'm never going to like presence. It's the whole album sounds like an afterthought. I mean, and here's the thing. Here's where the cracks start to show. Here is where they all start going in different directions as far as people. Robert Plant's got kids. Jimmy Page has heroin. John Bonham's got a kid. John Paul Jones has a family. They've all got more money they can ever know what to do with. John Paul Jones has already flirted with quitting the band at once and had to be talked into staying. Um, At this point in time, Robert Plant's had several vocal surgeries. I mean, they're not the same four guys that they were for those early albums. They weren't as focused. They weren't as cohesive. You know, Presence sounds like, well, it's time to do another album, so let's go ahead and get it done. I think that's what we've got at this point in time with the band. I think now we're finally starting to see the cracks in the surface. That is sadly a common thing with bands when they're this successful. You get this far enough into their career, their art starts to suffer. And I don't know that they're able to see it at the time. And I'm sure they were very proud of Presence. I'm sure they thought they were putting out another great Led Zeppelin album. But an objective observer is not going to feel the same way as somebody that's too close to it.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like it's like a confusing album to listen to because there's some songs that are like Achilles' Last Stand that was like, this is too damn long. This could probably be done in half the time, at least.
Easily.
And it
Easily.
probably would have been a much more impactful song. Um,
But do you even tell me? Honestly, okay, honestly, we're doing this right here live on camera. Can you even remember how T for One goes? Hot Zone for Nowhere, Candy Store Rock. Can you remember how any of those songs go? Honestly, can you?
no,
No, that's the problem. That's the problem.
it's lacking presence.
It's like, yeah, it's just, yeah. So I don't
It's
know.
got the thing is it's kind of weird. It's like Led Zeppelin is there, but there's no delivery, there's no punch, there's no hook, there's no catch. The bridging, forget about. It was like
Their hearts weren't in it.
just yeah, yeah, really. Their hearts weren't in it. It was very unenthusiastic,
Yeah.
very enthusiastic. It's a flatliner. It really was a flatliner of an album where this is the part. It's the same thing. Like uh, we're the Who. They just turned
The
into a
Who.
band that just produced each. It was like, oh, we're just gonna come up with this next album, put it out, and we're just gonna come up with this next album, put it out. And they weren't doing anything that was passionate or catchy or cool. You're 100.
Yeah.
I agree with you 100% on Presence.
I am not shocked. I did not think I was going to be getting an argument today about Presence. Now, I'll tell you what, though, the next album after Presence, that's the one that tends to be pretty polarizing for Zeppelin fans, more so than Presence is, oddly enough. In Through the Outdoor. Now, before I tell you what I think about it, what do you think of In Through the Outdoor?
You're the one supposed to be getting interviewed, not me.
No, 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 no. You're in the hot seat first. What do
I'm
you
in the
think of
hot
Into
seat
the
first.
Outdoor?
Um, well, it's interesting. I did the first time I listened to it, like start to finish, I was in eighth grade. So this was when Garrett was 13, just
Mm-hmm.
started playing guitar, gave up the violin and classical music. All of this was like new and exciting to me. The second time I listened to it about a year and a half later, it was almost like I couldn't just like take the CD out of the player and throw it across the room. And there's partial reasoning for it. I love seeing how you're laughing right now, even though you have the audio off.
I love In Through the Outdoor. I
Yeah.
absolutely love it. It is a departure. Now, here's the thing. Here's the thing that's interesting about In Through the Outdoor. We talked about Jimmy Page's state of mind and his general health and well-being. It had deteriorated to the point where he was effectively checked out at this point in time. But they had to make another album. Rather than just phone in another presence, what ended up happening is Robert Plant and John Paul Jones totally took the wheel. This is very much a Jonesy and Plant record. And that is why it is so much a departure from their previous work. That's why you have stuff on here like Carousel Ombra. You know, you would not have gotten that if Jimmy Page was at the wheel at this point in time. And from what I understand, Page has never come out and said that he doesn't like the album, but he regrets his lack of involvement. And the plan was the follow up for In Through the Outdoor was going to be a return to form, very much a heavy, bombastic rock album that he was going to be driving. In Through the Outdoor is not a Jimmy Page album. I mean, obviously he's all over it, but you're hearing when we talked earlier about, John Paul Jones' influence. John Paul Jones, this is his album, In Through the
Yeah,
Outdoor.
this is his
And I think it's
big.
incredible.
Yeah, this is his big piece.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I mean, like the third time I listened to it was like the whole like this is not the Led Zeppelin I know, but this is very interesting. And what were the things that came out technically that made this so different with Jones' writing versus Page's writing?
Well, with John Paul Jones, it's going to be very keyboard fueled, and that's going to take the music in a totally different direction. And what's cool about this is at this point in time, keyboard technology is advancing so rapidly that he's gone way beyond just messing around with a Mellotron. There's synths and keyboards all over that album. You're very much hearing the sounds that were available at that moment in time. Very, very cutting edge stuff. They recorded it at Polar Studios, which was owned by ABBA, which was an absolutely top flight, cutting edge studio, absolutely state of the art. So they were looking to push technology as far as they could on this album, and it sounds like it, they did.
Yeah, I mean, they couldn't have picked a more perfect time to start getting tech friendly on something like that. I mean, previously, I think the best sounding keyboard group might have been The Doors. And
Oh
that's
yeah, that sounds fantastic.
yeah, and that's just really because they only knew how well to use that shitty technology. Um, yeah, so what I mean, so yeah, obviously Jones is going to have a very keyboard heavy uh influence on the band, but what were other things? Were there songs that were calmer? Were there songs that got wilder? Were there new kinds of music that got involved?
So they were taking things in a bit more of a mellow direction. And the mellow direction that you hear on It Through the Outdoor is coming from Robert Plant. Now, not a lot of people know this, but at this point in time, Robert Plant had just dealt with severe personal tragedy. He was involved in a bad car accident on vacation that almost crippled him, and his kid died suddenly while he was away on tour in Oakland, actually. And he got word that his son died at like 5 years old. And All of My Love is about his dead son.
Mhm.
So now at this point in time, you're dealing with a band who's got all this personal shit going on, and now they're dealing with personal tragedies. And that's informing their writing. And that's definitely going to take things in a more somber, mellow direction. That plus John Paul Jones steering things. I mean, it's a wonder that In Through the Outdoor sounds even as much as Led Zeppelin as it does. I mean, it is an album apart from their catalog because of all these reasons. I mean, it had to sound different. There was no way they were going to go in there and cut another Led Zeppelin 4 in 1979. It just simply couldn't have happened with where they were at as human beings and the kind of
Yeah,
music they were writing. Yeah,
yeah, and plus Jimmy Page's state of mind at that time, his music.
just out of his mind. Yeah.
Yeah, he's at like he's gone, and when you're that far gone, your technicality is shit. Like there was a point where the Allman Brothers, their addiction, their alcoholism got so bad. There's a point when they're not even recorded live anymore, and then they get back. I can't remember the name of the album where you hear whatever one Crazy Love was on,
Mhm.
and it was just more or less like the same thing over and over again, which is the so not Allman Brothers thing. Like they're just, it's just almost flatlining. Um,
You can get to a point where the band kind of almost loses the plot to a degree. I believe that if it hadn't been for the creativity that came bubbling out of John Paul Jones and the creativity that came out of grief for Robert Plant, we would have gotten another presence. We would have gotten another flatliner from Zeppelin at this point in time. Obviously, I love pop, and there's In Through the Outdoor is largely a pop record in many ways. So it was never going to really be polarizing for me. But also remember that with me exploring their entire catalog all at one shot and hearing stuff like Fool in the Rain and All of My Love on the radio nonstop, to me, that was every bit the sound of Led Zeppelin as Whole Lot of Love was. Something else about In Through the Outdoor that I do want to touch upon, though, is John Bonham. Now, when you look back at stuff like the sessions for Physical Graffiti, the stuff that was written and recorded new for that album, he was incredibly involved behind the scenes in arranging everything. He was almost conducting things, even more so than Jimmy Page was in some ways, figuring out exactly when to start and stop everything on songs, how to make it make all sense, all make sense, guiding the band through each take. But during the In Through the Outdoor sessions, at this point, he is deep in the throes of alcoholism, which, as we know, is about to take his life. I wonder how involved he even was. And it hasn't really been talked about much. But I wonder if that made a bit of a difference too. Now, you can't find any fault in his performance on In Through the Outdoor. He still sounds incredible. But how involved was he? That I'd
I'm
like to know.
I'm probably gonna guess that he wasn't. He was just more so there, probably. And that's very normal with people who are deep in any form of addiction. There's a certain point when they just stop giving a shit about anything other than when their next fix is going to be.
Yeah, that's a real shame, man.
Yeah. Yeah, I would be that that is an interesting question to bring up. It just kind of throws people off from that expectation of like, oh, this is Zeppelin, it's upbeat, whole lot of love, um, good times, bad times, Stairway to Heaven, When the Levee Breaks. It's like
Yep.
these are the songs you put on, and people are feeling good and singing along.
Now, you see, this is the reason specifically why I put you in the hot seat and wanted to get your take on In Through the Outdoor. This is a
Yeah,
critical point in their catalog. This is the final Led Zeppelin album. I didn't want to just say In Through the Outdoor. Some fans don't like it. I think it's neato. On to Coda. It was important that we dove in on this one. It's a sad way for them to end their catalog, really. In spite of the fact that I love the album, I hate the circumstances that created it. And it's unfortunate.
definitely, absolutely. Now on to Coda.
Oh, it's
Unless there's
trash.
something else you want
Anyway.
to talk about.
Oh, it's trash. Onto the box set. Now,
The box set.
I mean, Coda was just odds and sods. It came out in 1982, and they folded the band after John Bonham sadly passed away. I think it was within a few months they announced it. They made it official. They had no intention of actually going on without their brother, and they had just a few things left over in the vaults that, for obvious reasons, had never come out. But they're like, well, let's just give people one last thing, and they put it out as Coda. And curiously enough, they left off two of the stronger B-sides that they had available, which were Hey, Hey, What Can I Do? And Traveling Riverside Blues. Could have gone on Coda and didn't. A friend of mine was recently joking that they feel like Coda was made up of tapes that just happened to be sitting on Peter Grant's desk, and no one had the interest in actually digging through any file cabinets. And they're like, here you go, Coda. And that's what we got.
That is what we got.
So, yeah.
It's trash. Done.
Coda, here's the thing. I'm not as hard on Coda as I am on Presence because Coda was never supposed to be an album. That wasn't the intention of it. This is like, here, guys, this is leftovers. This is what we got in the vaults sitting around collecting dust. Listen to it or don't. Doesn't matter. They never tried to pass it off as the next Led Zeppelin epic. So I can't come down on that as hard as I come down on Presence. That wouldn't be fair. I know what Coda is.
Yeah, their final farewell, their gift to us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is a nice farewell gesture. I would say is a
I'd
good.
say it's better than nothing.
Yeah, definitely, especially after polarizing Into the Outdoors and the shittiness that was present.
Oh God,
It's
but you
like
know,
eating Ben and Jerry's vanilla. You eat Ben and Jerry's
yes,
because there's chunks of stuff in it. But when you have Ben and Jerry's vanilla, there's no chunks. Why did
there's
I
no
buy
reason.
this?
There's no reason for it. Yeah, it really it brings home just how tragic it is that the band ended when they did and the way they did. Because as I had said earlier, they had every intention of doing a follow up to Into the Outdoor that was going to be a heavy rock album. Could you imagine what we would have gotten from Led Zeppelin in the early '80s had they kept going? I would have loved to have heard it, but it never had the chance to exist.
Yeah. It would have been interesting, really, because if Bonham lived, I mean, like if they could have stayed cognizant and functional for long enough, I mean, who knows what could have came out of Jones using uh, the new emerging keyboard technology.
Oh, the technology of the early '80s. Oh my God. It would have been really incredible. I would have loved to have heard it.
Yeah, and also, I mean, would Jimmy Page have managed to scavenge something together with just kind of like now or normally does, or with like how we talked about in our first interview, BC Rich? What kind of new technology, new guitars were coming out, and would Page have utilized it to, break the mold and see what else comes out? And this is the time too where there's just so much changing, especially with vocal effects, with drum effects.
Could you imagine Bonham with a Simmons electronic kit? Could you imagine Page with a guitar synth like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden were messing with, or Jimmy Page playing through like a full stereo Bradshaw rack? I mean, that would have been incredible. And Jonesy with just a rack of '80s synths. I would have loved to have heard it. It would have been so cool.
It
But
would have. It truly would have. I mean, even nowadays, I mean, they've got even just the three of them could have gotten together with Bonham's cousin. Is it his cousin or did his son get?
his son Jason.
Yeah, his son Jason. I mean, and he sounds just like him too when he plays. I mean, if the four of them can get together and just be like, hey, let's just see what we come up with, even if it's just a couple of songs.
It's never going to happen.
Unfortunate.
Unfortunately, it's never going to happen. But I don't know if you realize this, but we have managed to be talking about Led Zeppelin for like an hour and a half.
We could easily stretch this to like 2 or 3 hours if we really wanted to.
I know that's what this band does to you.
Yeah, exactly. This interview is going to be long, like their songs.
Yes, yes. This is going to be the Achilles' last interview.
Achilles' last interview. But to reverse thinking about it instead of like, hey, cut it in half, be like, no, you should have stretched this out even further. Yeah,
Oh God! In my time of interview.
in my time of an interview, I can name it that. That'd be a good title right there. In my
That
time,
or the interview remains the same. There you go.
the interview remains the same. Yeah, was there anything significant at that time when when the song remains the same came out? That was another question I was thinking of is the
Oh,
live.
well, the most significant thing that people should be aware is that actually was not recorded when that film came out. They actually recorded that at Madison Square Garden on tour in 1973. It was 4 years in the making, that project. And then there were all sorts of delays, budgetary concerns. I think they had to get a different director. And then they decided to do all those vignettes between to give you like a taste of each member's personality. By the time it actually came out, they were basically a different band at that point in time. And they also felt like the recordings, the concerts themselves were not really their strongest sets on that tour.
Despite that people praise it.
The people love it because it's a time capsule. It's Led Zeppelin. It's still awesome, but they felt that there were better shows that they could have filmed and didn't. So
Unfortunate,
yeah,
unfortunately. Is there anything else you'd want to share or say before we ever close, Tommy?
I will say this. I will say that Peter Grant was very much the fifth member of that band, and it's arguable that they would not have gotten as far as they did without his help. He changed the game in terms of rock music management. He made sure that they were paid and paid well, and that set a standard for other artists to actually make serious money. He would demand that Led Zeppelin get 90% of the receipts at every show they did on tour. The promoters would lose their mind, but they knew if they said no, he would just take them to a different stadium and they would lose out. So they said yes, and Led Zeppelin was paid the money that they deserved. And that's all thanks to Peter Grant. He didn't take any shit, and he made sure he had their backs.